Keep your eyes down when his grace enters, miss. The last companion who looked at him fainted dead away, and the one before her asked to be sent home by morning. My own housekeeper said it in the lower hall the evening Lady Weston's carriage arrived, and I stood on the stair above, unseen, waiting for the frightened murmur of agreement. Instead, a level voice answered, "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. I shall look wherever courtesy requires. My name is Aldrich Vane, Duke of Coreth, and for 3 years after the fire I had lived as a man already half buried. Coreth Hall stood real enough, its avenue of beeches, its shuttered south wing, its drawing room sealed like a house of mourning. The fire had been quick and I had not been. The left side of my face bore the proof of that. I am not a vain man, or I had not been one before. Vanity requires a mirror you are willing to look into. Society found its own economy in me. The fearful kept their distance and called it prudence. The pitying sent cards I did not answer. The crueler sort made sport of my name in drawing rooms they assumed I would never enter, and they assumed rightly. My mother died the winter after the fire, and I grieved her with a quietness that frightened even the servants. My steward, a good man called Dennick, brought me papers. I signed them. I did not ask after what lay beyond Coreth's iron gates. Lady Weston was the one soul who breached those gates. My late mother's dearest friend, 71 years old, and incapable of pretending she did not see what she plainly saw. She visited every autumn and talked of whatever she liked, which I had learned to be grateful for. But that autumn her knees had grown frail, and her companion came with her, the woman with the level voice from the lower hall. Her name was Mira Solent, and she was quiet in the way that still water is quiet, not for lack of depth, but for lack of agitation. I was aware of her from the first evening. Lady Weston talked. Miss Solent sat a little behind her, adjusting a shawl, refilling a cup, otherwise folding her hands and listening. She was perhaps 30, dark hair simply dressed, and she wore gray or pale brown, the colors of a woman who has spent years learning to be helpful, and not noticed. She did not stare at my face. That was the first thing. I had grown accustomed to 2 kinds of looking: the flinch, a rapid dart of the eyes downward as though they had touched something hot, or the fixed smile that said, "I am looking at your eyes and only your eyes. I promise you I see nothing else." Miss Solent did neither. She looked at me when the conversation required it, and elsewhere when it did not, and it was so natural that I sat the better part of an hour before I understood what was different. She was treating me as an ordinary man in an ordinary room. I did not know what to do with that. I spoke more than I intended that first evening, and when I made some dry observation about the season's hunting, I heard Miss Solent give a small, unguarded laugh, as though she had forgotten to suppress it. She pressed her fingers to her lips at once, glancing at Lady Weston as if she had overstepped. She had not. Lady Weston beamed. I found I was still looking at the place where the laugh had been. Even Lady Weston, who loved me, thought it kind to caution her. I overheard them next morning through the half-open door of the morning room. "He is a good man, my dear, but he is a closed door," Lady Weston said. "Wiser women than either of us have bruised themselves against that door." A pause. Then Miss Solent, level as ever. "I have not found him closed, my lady, only careful." I carried that sentence the rest of the day the way a man carries a coal in a cold pocket. Lady Weston rested in the mornings, and Miss Solent, I discovered, walked the East Gallery when she had an hour to herself. The East Gallery was mine. The family portraits, the old maps, the escritoire I had not sat at in 3 years. I came upon her one morning before a painting of my father as a young man, her head tilted at the angle a person takes when genuinely thinking. She heard me and turned, and she did not start. She simply said, "He has your jaw." "He was considered handsome," I said, before I could think whether I meant it as a wound to myself or simply as a fact. She looked at me then, fully, the way you look at a man you are taking proper measure of. I expect so. There was nothing arch in it, no manufactured kindness to paper over what I had implied. She simply agreed, moved to the next painting, and said, "Is this his mother? She is magnificent." I followed her. I could not account for it. I told her about my grandmother, who had indeed been magnificent and had terrified 3 generations of housekeepers into excellence, and Miss Solent asked good questions, the kind that show a person has actually heard what came before. We walked the whole gallery, and at its end she thanked me as though I had given her something of genuine worth. I stood there long afterward with the odd sensation of a man in a cold room who has only just noticed that someone has lit the fire. A few evenings later, the youngest housemaid, a frightened new girl called Polly, lost her grip on the tea tray as I came through the drawing-room door. China went everywhere. The girl stood frozen, eyes brimming, certain she was ruined. Before I could speak, Miss Solent was kneeling on the carpet, gathering shards. "Nothing broken that matters," she said quietly. "Fetch a cloth and we shall have it done before the tea cools." Then she looked up at me, her hands full of my broken china, and said, "Polly is new, Your Grace, and quick to learn. She will do well here." I heard myself answer that china was easily replaced. The first gentle thing a servant had heard from me in 3 years, and she had drawn it out of me as simply as breath. I am not a swift man in matters of feeling. Grief and ruin had made a careful man more careful still. But I began to notice things. She read in the evenings while Lady Weston dozed, with the same full attention she gave to everything. One night Lady Weston was unwell, and Miss Solent sat with her until past 2 in the morning. The next day she was quiet in a different way, the way of a person running on what is left after the reserves are spent, and she did not complain by a syllable. I noticed that when I came into a room, she did not brace herself. 3 days before Lady Weston was to return to London, I asked Miss Solent whether she would walk with me in the garden. It was the first time I had made that walk since the fire. The garden was overgrown at the edges, the box hedges gone shaggy, and I felt a peculiar shame at it, as though I had neglected a living thing, which I had. She walked beside me and said, "You loved this garden once." It was not a question. I asked her how she knew, and she said, "Because you look at it the way a person looks at something they still love but have given up arguing with." I stopped walking. I am not certain how long I stood there. The light was late afternoon gold, and the beeches at the far end of the avenue were just beginning to turn. She stopped too and waited, without pressing me, without filling the silence with a comforting speech, waited as a person waits who believes that what is in the silence has value. "I did not want anyone to see it like this," I said at last, meaning the garden, meaning more than the garden. She looked at me plainly and said, "I am glad I have seen it." I asked her to stay. Not in those words. I am a careful man, and she was a careful woman, and neither of us was practiced at speaking things we had only just allowed ourselves to feel. I told her that Corinth needed more than Dennick, that the library had gone unordered for 3 years, that if she would remain the autumn out, I would be grateful. It was a coward's opening, and she saw through it and let me have it anyway. Lady Weston looked from one of us to the other, like a woman who had just won a wager with herself, and surrendered her companion to my library without a single question. She stayed the autumn. The library took shape under her hands, and so, though I did not say it aloud, did I. She stayed the winter too, for Lady Weston declared London insufferable and extended her own visit, chaperone and conspirator both. And on a January evening, with the first snow coming down past the library windows, I could not keep to the arrangement any longer. She was at the long table with a lamp and my grandfather's books, and I stood at the end of it like a man at the edge of deep water. "I asked you to stay for the library," I said. "That was not the truth. I am asking you now to stay for me." She set down the book. She rose and crossed to me and looked at my face, the whole of it, the ruined side and the spared, and laid her hand gently against the cheek one had touched in 3 years. "I knew about the library, Your Grace," she said. "I stayed anyway. The morning she became my duchess was a quiet one. No congregation, no assembly of silk and whispered judgment. Only Dennick and the vicar and Lady Weston, who wept cheerfully and claimed the whole affair as her own doing, which we allowed, because it was nearly true. I placed the ring on her hand, and she looked up at me, and her face was the face of a woman who has been seen, wholly and without reserve, and who is not afraid of what was found. I was not afraid either. That was the thing she had given me. The courage to be looked at by her, and to find it was not ruin but the beginning of everything. A man does not deserve such a gift. He can only be grateful for it the rest of his days, and I intend to be exactly that.